So appreciate that. This is class week number 2 of the study of it's called Walk With Me. It's really taken from a book by a preacher that I said last week that I had the privilege of listening to week after week because we attended the congregation where he preached. His name is Prentice Metter. And here's the book. It's just really focusing in on Jesus and what was Jesus thinking maybe at the particular time when he wrote in the book of Mark. How does Mark define Jesus differently maybe than some of the other Gospels? We looked at that. And then how were the people of the day, even the disciples, how were they reacting to Jesus? And not just really how we could say how we would react to Jesus, but how were they reacting to Jesus in view of all of their surroundings, in view of their culture, and in view of their history? And I think that's fascinating when you look at it that way, because it has really unveiled some things for me that I would not have necessarily thought about. I've never been a Jew in AD 30 and listened to Jesus when he came on the scene, and what did he mean and what was he saying. So last week we started out by just focusing in on the term that Jesus used many times in his ministry, and that is, follow me. What did that really mean? I mean, you think, well, that's pretty simple. I know what that means. But what does that really mean? And really, what does that really mean for a Jew in AD 30? If you lived at that particular time, you knew that there were others that had come along and had said, follow me. There were others that had come along and they had been the so-called Messiah, but they were not the Messiah. And many people followed them, and many people died because of them. They were promising a political solution to their dilemma. And what was their dilemma? Rome. That was their dilemma. Their country, they were so suppressed. And we looked at what would a Jew really think of and really focus on the very first time that he heard Jesus say, follow me. And I believe that when they heard it, the first thing that came to their mind was, if Jesus is the Messiah, if he's who he said he was, we're going to get some relief. We're going to get out from under Rome. He's going to come in and yield a political will that is going to help us and save us. So when Jesus said, follow me, Simon, Andrew, James, and John, they immediately dropped their nets and they followed Jesus. But I also believe that they did not follow him for the right reason. They were politically charged. I think maybe even that Jesus called them personally, they could even look at it from a selfish standpoint and say, wow, we're being called by the Messiah, and we're going to be something. But as we know the rest of the story. We know that Jesus eventually unfolds what it really meant to follow him to the 12. He didn't tell them everything at once. He just told them as much maybe as they could accept or maybe they could grasp. But at the same time, Jesus, even though Jesus was so patient and he was so understanding, and even at the beginning of his ministry when people would come to him and just ask some things that were ridiculous, Jesus showed a lot of patience. But you can see, especially in Mark's writing, and I think it's interesting that Mark points out that Jesus really got frustrated with them as well. Last week we looked at a couple of things. In Mark 4 and verse 13, he says, "Don't you understand?" That would be me. That sounds like me and my maybe lack of patience with someone. "Why are you so afraid?" he said in 4:40, talking to his 12. "Why are you so dull? Don't you see? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened?" He asks them in chapter 8 and verse 17. "Do you have eyes but fail to see, ears but fail to hear? Don't you remember?" Jesus said to them. "Do you still not understand?" As you can look at the progression starting in chapter 4. But you know, the challenges of the 12 are very similar to some of the challenges that we have today as well. You look at politics and power and wealth and success and pleasure. All the things really today that say, "Follow me," and they compete in our lives. And Satan makes sure that they compete in our lives, that we have to continuously take inventory and root those things out when they become out of balance. I find that my life many times consists of spinning plates. I'm really good at this area. Things are going really well, and wait a minute. I've got to run over here and get this plate going. Then I get that going, and the thing that I was really good at 6 months ago needs some help. And so that's me. And these things compete with us. They compete against Jesus in our life. So last week I ended just like Jesus asked the 12. I was going to do a pop quiz, but I didn't. I ran out of time. But just like Jesus asked the 12, we need to ask ourselves, are we heeding or are we obeying? Follow me. Follow me instead of someone else. Follow me instead of worrying about your job, instead of letting things burden you down, instead of letting your finances burden you down. And I know that those things aren't easy. Follow me instead of being fretful about politics and the way that things are going in our world today. Follow me, Jesus said, instead of something or someone else. Then he said, follow me right where you are. It's a decision, and it's a decision that we have to make right now. For me, in spinning plates, it's a decision I have to make often about following Jesus. And Jesus doesn't require us to have our act totally together before we follow him. The apostles didn't. They didn't have their act together at all. In fact, they really didn't know what they were getting into. Not really, not truly. And then follow Jesus all the way to his destination, which is heaven. All other promises are worthless compared to that. And then Jesus said, follow him to his mission. And what was his mission? We're going to dive into that a little bit deeper today. Jesus really only had one focus. Only one. And I look at my life sometimes and I think, why can't I just have that one focus like Jesus did? And we'll get into that. But Jesus' mission is really the end of Mark. And it says, go into the world and preach the gospel to all creation, Mark 16 and verse 15. So we have to look at these things, and you have to take action. And we're going to look at how Jesus asked the apostles to take action on some of these things today. So, Shifting gears here a little bit, Jesus had one center in his life. His life revolved around just one thing. What do you think that is? What was that? Okay, all right. Doing God's will. Nolan said fulfilling his Father's wishes. That was it. That was every decision that Jesus made in his life centered around that. A lot of people, when Jesus would live that way and act that way and preach that way, they didn't understand it. And I believe that's why many people turned away from Jesus, especially toward the end of his ministry. So, Jesus was preaching, understand me, but people didn't understand. Even the apostles didn't understand him. You know, I was trying to think of an example in my life where there was just a massive misunderstanding on my part, so I'm going to use a situation that happened to me back in high school. I had this American history teacher, and I remember when my schedule came out and they said, "Hey, did you get so-and-so?" I go, "Yeah." Ugh, you're going to wish you hadn't. He's a teacher I'll never, ever forget. He taught me things that other teachers never taught me. He was super strict. If you didn't speak up and your voice radiate out when he asked you a question, he would walk over to his desk, he would grab his grade book, and everything was on points with him. And he'd just start subtracting points from you because, hey, I can't hear you. If I had to listen to you all day, I couldn't get anything done. Speak up. If you have something to say, say it. And whoa. You know, the first time he did that. We had kids that were shy in class. He didn't care. He'd grab his grade book and he would start subtracting. I can tell you that after about 2 weeks of this guy in class, it wasn't that I just didn't really like him. I despised him. I just didn't even want to go to that class. And I remember one time he gave tests all the time. Nobody liked that. And I'm sitting there, and this guy was strict. He would walk around. He would watch you. He would make sure that everything was being done correctly. And I remember I'm down on my desk, and I'm writing, and I'm doing this, and this guy's behind me. He's poking me in the back. "Hey, what's number 4?" So I just keep on, and keep on, and he goes, "Hey, what's number 4?" And finally I turn around and I go, "Look, I can't even concentrate. Stop it." About that time, my high school teacher comes over. He grabs my paper. He tears it, and he says, "You fail for the quarter." Well, that wasn't good. And I was innocent. I didn't do anything wrong. And man, you think I despised him earlier. I really didn't like the guy now. So that happened, and I actually saw him do that to another person or two. And as the year went on, though, I kind of got past the anger and all of that, and I actually started listening to the guy. And maybe I began to warm up to him a little bit. He was so passionate about what he taught. He taught morals. I didn't have very many high school teachers teach morals, even back in the old days when I was in high school. He always made us define the word love. His definition was the care and concern for another's well-being. That's love. He said everybody has to have love and has to have care and concern for others' well-being. He told us how to treat people. He said, always treat people fair. Be considerate of others. He told us how important our character was. And he always would call out a person if he thought someone was doing something wrong. He always called out a person if he thought they were cheating. In fact, he owned some land down on the Buffalo River in Arkansas, and the government came in and really he felt had done an injustice to him, and he was able to go testify before the United States House of Representatives and told them what kind of injustice was being done. This guy wasn't quiet. He spoke up. This was an American history class, so he would call out the failings of our founding fathers, of world leaders, of U.S. leaders. And so I grew not to despise him as much, especially toward the end of the year, but I was certainly glad when the class was over. But it really challenged me. But a little later in life, my attitude toward him changed. I realized that I really didn't understand this guy like I thought I did. I was immature. I can tell you today he's my favorite teacher that I ever had, because he's the only teacher I can even remember anything that was taught, hardly, in high school. But at the time I didn't grasp it. I didn't understand it. I didn't know what he was really trying to teach. I didn't realize how much he really cared about me and everybody else in that class, and he was really trying to make a difference in people's life. Well, I believe that this also relates to what we're talking about today, Jesus. Jesus was so misunderstood. He knew he was going to be misunderstood. All the way back in Isaiah chapter 53, Isaiah says that he was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and like one from whom men hide their face, he was despised, and we did not esteem him. You think Jesus was misunderstood? Jesus had one thing in mind when he came to this earth: do the will of the Father, and we esteemed him not. Also in Psalm chapter 69, starting in verse 7, because for your sake I have borne reproach, dishonor has covered my face, I have become estranged from my brothers and an alien to my mother's sons. These two texts introduce Jesus in the Old Testament. They're not the kind of introductions you would expect for a king. We would expect a king, the King of Kings, to be loved and to be admired and to be understood. But these verses, they speak about him not being known by his own brothers, not being welcome in his own home, and he was a man of sorrows. I would think that Jesus knew, well, I know Jesus knew that these things would happen. But as Jesus was a human being as well, I would think that his family and his own home and the misunderstanding that he endured there really hurt. And when Jesus was a young boy, Luke 2 and verse 51 says that his mother treasured all these things in her heart about Jesus. That's about what we know of Jesus as a young child. He was a joy. He was a delight. But I also believe he was a puzzle to his family. Gradually, I think there's a misunderstanding gap that began to develop, especially with his own family. We saw it when he was 12 years old. And Jesus stayed behind in the temple when his family went on, and they didn't realize it. Caused this great anxiety with his family. His parents were frantic. They searched for him. And finally, they found him. And after they found him, their misunderstanding was really evident, I believe. When you look at Luke chapter 2, and he said to them, "Why is it that you were looking for me? Did you not know that I had to be about my Father's house?" But they did not understand the statement which he made to them. I can relate to his family. If your child's missing, that's panic mode. But Jesus says this. So I think that if I'm their family, that has to be a little puzzling to me at this particular point. Even though you think about the background that his mother and father had gone through, and from his conception all the way to his birth. Did you not know that I had to be about my Father's house? No, they didn't. I don't believe they knew. His parents didn't understand Jesus. And Jesus, as he continued to mature, and when he began his public ministry, because that's the next scene that we see of Jesus, the understanding grew even more. His teaching and I think his action became more difficult for his family to understand. They heard accusations about Jesus. Jesus' family did. They heard stories that were being told about Jesus. Until finally they felt the need to come and step in and take charge. That's what families do when you think one of your family members is being mistreated. Look at Mark chapter 3. I'm going to read 20 and 21 and then drop down to 30 through 35. We're going to spend some time here today, and I want hopefully it will help you as it's helped me. But Mark says, and he came home, and the crowd gathered again to such an extent that they could not even eat a meal. And when his own people heard of this, they went out to take custody of him, and they were saying, "He's lost his senses." Okay, so Jesus' family hears that people are saying Jesus has lost his senses. His hometown crowd were saying he's crazy. Outside, they sent word to him and called him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they said, "Behold, your mother and your brothers are outside looking for you." Answering them, he said, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" Looking about at those who were sitting around him, he said, "Behold, my mother and my brothers, for whoever does the will of God, he is my brother, sister, and mother." As we read in Isaiah a minute ago, Jesus was a man of sorrows. He experienced a lot of pain. And a lot of pain came from his very own town. A lot of pain came from his very own family. And they heard Jesus had gone insane, or at least people were accusing him of being crazy or gone insane, so they came to him. That's what a family would do. They most likely came to take him home. I can only guess what they were thinking when they heard these rumors. And they had to be wondering, with all of the things they knew about Jesus, what in the world does this mean? What is going on? There had to be some confusion there. And so they moved into the crowd, ready to take Jesus away because they loved him. And they knew they needed to talk to him. And I'm sure they meant well. And I'm sure they were just concerned. But they didn't understand Jesus. I know Jesus wanted his family to understand, but they did not. Familiar passage, John 1 and verse 11 says, "He came to his own, and those who were his own did not receive him." 7 and verse 5 of John says, "For not even his brothers were believing in him. So for us, looking back from our point of view, we can see how Jesus was misunderstood. He was misunderstood by his family. He was misunderstood by his disciples. He was misunderstood in his own hometown. In the book that I've been reading and looking and taking some of this information from, makes a good statement. Everyone stood to profit from Jesus' teaching and his work, but no one stood with him. So why is this story that Jesus talks about and reveals that people are thinking that he's insane and his family coming to him? Why is this story here? I've looked at it a lot of times and I really didn't know. I really didn't look at it that deeply. But I want us to look at it maybe a little bit closer. Let's look at it again. And he came home and the crowd gathered again to such an extent that he couldn't eat a meal. And when his own people heard of this, they went to take custody of him, for they were saying he had lost his senses. The New Century Version says he was out of his mind. From the world's standpoint, the accusations about Jesus could appear to be accurate. The word is translated here, he's lost his senses, could be translated as eccentric. What does eccentric mean? It's unconventional, slightly strange, different. Jesus was eccentric. He was strange compared to the world. And he wasn't selfish like the world was. He did the curious thing by humbling himself. He was a servant to others, even disregarding himself. Paul said in Philippians chapter 2, have this attitude in yourself, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but it emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant and being made in the likeness of men. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. What kind of person would do this? If you have a worldly point of view, well, he must be crazy. No wonder Jesus looked odd and eccentric. His behavior wasn't like any other leader they ever knew. He wasn't like any king that his disciples thought he was. How could they not be a little bit confused? And something else that Jesus says, for whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. John's gospel captures it this way. Jesus said to them, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. I can do nothing on my own initiative. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I do not seek my own will, but the will of him who sent me. Look at Jesus' focus. For I've come down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. So Jesus said, when you lift up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he, and I do nothing of my own initiative, but I speak these things as the Father taught me. But so that the world may know that I love the Father, I do exactly as the Father commanded me. Get up and let's go from here. Jesus was so different because he just had this one and one only mission, main mission, to do his Father's will, period. That was it. His life revolved around it. It defined him. It was the center of every single decision that he made. But even his family didn't understand. And as I looked at myself, even as I look at myself today, do I understand how important every decision of my life should focus around God's will? Do I ask myself that on every decision? No, I get distracted. I let sometimes or somewhat important things take precedent over the most important things. And I ask myself at this point, what does my life revolve around? What makes my daily decisions? Is it God or is it me? So, brethren, I think that all we really want to do is please God in our lives. And I know that every one of us have that focus and have that desire. And how can I become more like that in everything? What hinders me from becoming more like that? If you know me, you could sum it up in one word. It'd be selfish. I want to do what I want to do. Selfishness is everywhere. It's the center of the world. But that's no excuse for me, just because the world does it. John 17, verse 14 and 15, and then dropping down to 18, I've given them your word, and the world has hated them, because they are not of the world, even as I am not of the world. I do not ask you to take them out of the world, but to keep them from the evil one. Jesus' prayer. And as you sent me into the world, in verse 18, I also have sent them into the world. 2 chapters earlier from this, Jesus said to his followers in John 15, if the world hates you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own, but because you are not of the world, I chose you out of the world. Because of this the world hates you. Remember, the word that I said to you, a slave is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they kept my word, they will also keep yours also. So from the world's standard, true Christianity continues to be at odds. Why do I can't really speak for everybody, but why do I have such a hard time with that? Why am I so shocked when I see what happens in the world and how it's so opposed to Christianity and how people are so, I don't know what a good word would be, so radically against it? Well, it's off-center to the rest of the population. We're crazy sometimes compared to the world. The broad way and the narrow way are opposed to one another. They go in opposite directions. And, even if someone from the world reads the New Testament and sees things like new birth and new life and a new heart and a new direction, they would think that's exaggerated. A lot later in Peter's life, he talks about the reaction of old acquaintances to his new life. 1 Peter 4 and verse 4, non-believers think it is strange that you do not do the many wild and wasteful things they do, so they insult you. The previous verse that he's referring to here, I probably should have read that first. In the past, you wasted too much time doing what non-believers enjoy. You were guilty of sexual sins, evil desires, drunkenness, wild and drunken parties, and hateful idol worship. Richard's mentioned this before in his life that, when you really turn things around for you and when you really make a concerted effort to follow Jesus, people will retaliate to you. They'll heap abuse on you. And that's so evident today. Maybe it's just because my lifetime is my lifetime and that's the narrow view that I have, but it just seems like it's worse than ever. You think about someone, even when I was in the corporate world, people would look at you when you wouldn't go out and you wouldn't drink with the group. You were this odd person. People would be standoffish from you. A Christian waitress may be called a prude by her boss because she wouldn't dress like he wanted her to dress in his restaurant. A Christian young man is laughed at because he goes to worship versus a school function. These Christians aren't arrogant like the world calls them. They're not hateful like the world says. These people don't even rub their faith in their face. They're just trying to be more like Jesus and less like the world. And Peter wrote, "Do not suffer for murder, theft, or any other crime, nor because you trouble other people." The New Living Translation, I liked how it said this. It says, "If you suffer, however, it must not be for murder, stealing, making trouble, or prying into other people's affairs, but it is no shame to suffer for being a Christian. Praise God for the privilege of being called by His name." I love that. These Christians, Peter talking about himself, these Christians are not combative. They were simply choosing God over everybody else. In Jesus' relationships, if you noticed and you follow Him throughout His life, they narrowed as His ministry progressed. His story began with large crowds. He had massive crowds. Couldn't handle the crowds, it seemed like at times. Jesus could, but his followers couldn't. But when His mission became more clear, people lost interest. Crowds thinned out. Jesus is questioned more. He's accused, He's ignored, He's slandered. And He was certainly misunderstood. Eventually, many of His disciples leave. From 12 even to 11. And if Jesus' lifestyle brought His death, why would we be surprised by being tested ourselves and having difficulties? I was talking to Lance before the class started, and sometimes I look at my life and man, do I have it easy. Things are going well. I live in a nice place. I'm super comfortable. And then I look at these passages and I wonder, am I doing something wrong? Why do I have it so easy? Jesus said it's not going to be easy. And it hasn't always been easy, and I know what that means, but we should expect discomfort. Living for God will not bring us peace to those who are outside His will. They won't like it. He was misunderstood, and so will we be misunderstood. So what do you do? What do you do when your faith is misunderstood? Again, what did Jesus do Let's look at this passage again. Jesus asked, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" Then he looked at those sitting around him. "Here are my mother and brothers. My true brother and sister and mother are those who do what God wants." First, Jesus turns to his very center. He turns to the will of God, and we need to do that as well. I need to do that as well. Mark calls out 3 different areas when Jesus is praying, and he's praying in moments of crisis. In Mark chapter 1 and verse 35, and 6 verse 46, and Mark chapter 14 starting in verse 32. All 3 of these instances show Jesus in a crisis, but where does he turn? He didn't have any human support. He didn't have any really place to turn here on earth. No one else really understood what he was dealing with. So he prays and he turns to God. And secondly, Jesus did have a human support. When you look at this passage, he considered them his family. My true brothers and sisters and mother are those who do what God wants. Our human support is right here. It's the church. The church revolves around the will of God. And then he looked at those sitting around him and said, "Here are my brothers and my mother. Here are the ones who are going to understand. Here are the ones who know where our lives should be centered around." So, you know, the decision to turn to God and the decision to wrap yourself around the church is really the same decision, because that's where the human support comes from. When you turn to God, you turn to God's people as well. It may be off-center to the world, but it is on course. So I haven't really allowed for much discussion or feedback or anything. I just plow right through this stuff. And anybody have any questions or comments as we are close to the last bell? Shelby? It's coming. Just slowly. It's coming. Thank you, Lance.
You know, going back to that original setting where he's around his home and talking to people that knew him. It's interesting how Satan really attacks him. Satan attacks him through the religious leaders of the world. I mean, that's exactly, and I think that kind of holds true today, that for those that are trying to believe the truth, Satan doesn't necessarily come at us from all the evils of the world. He comes through us through some maybe powerful religious leaders that teach a part of the truth, that make people comfortable, and steals them away that way. The devil is so deceptive in the way he goes about trying to destroy that God and the entire truth. I think it's interesting how that all transpired.
Yeah, I agree. I believe that when we do try to teach someone that loves God, but they haven't embraced the entire truth, sometimes when we teach them, they resent us. They say that we're arrogant and that we're rubbing our beliefs in their face. And so that can happen to us. It happened to Jesus. Why would we be surprised that it would happen to us today? Thank you. We'll pick up there next week.